want to convince their base they're still wedded to impeachment, but a baseless legal claim is an odd way to show that. So some people have apparently lost their mind. There's a person online, his name is Jason Rabinowitz, and he goes by the name Airline Flyer, and he tries to find deals on airlines. And he found a deal that was a $246 round trip to Madrid. He said, I have no plans to go to Madrid. I have no need to go to Madrid. I don't know what I'll do once in Madrid, but for this price, I should go to Madrid. This prompted Eric Holthaus, who is a climate activist, a meteorologist, to begin losing his mind. And when I say begin, I mean it's lost. It's over. He tweeted, we are in a climate emergency. What the F are you thinking, you selfish entitled bleep? People are literally dying because of this kind of bleep. You're just trying to fly to Madrid, man. Then he says, some kinds of air travel are necessary and always will be. I'm not telling you not to visit your dying grandmother in another continent, but flying just to fly, with literally no need to do so other than the price is cheap, that should be outlawed. It's just as deadly as a gun. I mean, not really. If you shoot a gun at someone, you're trying to kill them. If you fly in an airplane, you're mainly trying to go from one place to another. But Eric Holthaus was not having this. He says, this kind of behavior is the same as taking a gun and just firing blindly into the air toward a crowd just because you think it's fun to shoot a gun. You don't care who you're hurting. You just care about yourself. So as producer Mike pointed out, just going along with this metaphor, he thinks it's okay to fly the plane to visit your dying grandma. So if you want to see your dying grandma, apparently you can shoot randomly into a crowd. He says, unexamined privilege like this is literally causing the biggest existential threat we've ever faced as a species. I'm not saying don't fly. I'm just saying there are alternative modes and styles of travel that don't require burning tons of kerosene amid a climate emergency. Okay, so if you want to fly, how is it? So, to Madrid? What are the alternative modes and styles of travel? You can take like a sailboat? You're going to go get like a schooner from 1725 and just use the power of the wind? Everybody's got scurvy. They're eating onions to fend off the scurvy. Is where we're going with this? Eric Holthaus then continues, my timeline is full of hundreds of people outraged that I use the word bleep. On our current path, where high-consumption lifestyles are normalized and even celebrated, the people who did the least to cause the climate emergency will be the first to die. That's outrageous. The fact that the airline industry and fossil fuel industry knows this, that's outrageous. Well, just to be fair, I'd like to point out that most of the people in third world countries are dying right now because they don't have enough access to carbon-based fuel systems. Those are really efficient, and they're really good. He says the fact that our leaders are complicit in the permanent destruction of the biosphere on the only planet in the known universe that can harbor life, that's outrageous. These behaviors are outrageous. But I believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt. And then he says, I shouldn't use the word to talk about that person. It's the system as a whole that needs change. What a nice guy this is. Change is coming whether you like it or not. Well, joining us on the line to discuss some of the alarmism that has apparently overtaken a lot of the conversation is Dr. Caleb Rossiter. He's a climate statistician and executive director of the CO2 Coalition. He has a long, distinguished career as a specialist in research methods with a focus on the use and misuse of statistics and models in the climate change debate. They wrote a piece in the Washington Examiner this week talking about the effects of climate change, what is causing all of that in the first place. Caleb Rossiter, thanks so much for joining the program. Really appreciate it.
Mr. Shapiro, it's wonderful to hear you. What you have just described is what I face every morning when I come into work and look at the probably 20 completely insane stories about the effects of carbon dioxide on people's lives, that these emissions from the reliable, cheap energy the world lives on. And I have to decide which of those 20 I should try to bat down during the day with my media staff and my researchers. And these are not in obscure journals. You're describing someone outraged who somehow has popped up somewhere with these crazy things to say about flying to Portugal. These are in Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, government publications around the world, the head of the UN. My dear friend Nancy Pelosi, the leader of my party, the Speaker of the House, every day says we're in an existential crisis. Once you believe that, it's time to do crazy things, and they are proposing completely crazy things.
So let's start from the very basics. What do you think, Dr. Rossiter, is happening with the climate? Is climate change occurring? If it is occurring, how much of that is man-made? I've heard of a spectrum of opinions on this, ranging from the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, that suggests nearly all climate change is due to carbon emissions that are man-made. And then I've had Dr. Roy Spencer on the program. He suggested that he's sort of a lukewarm guy, meaning he believes that climate change is happening, but he believes that there's sort of a spectrum of opinion on whether 50% is man-made or 75 or 100%. Where do you stand on this?
Ben, with trepidation, let me just contradict you on one point. Okay?
Sure.
The United Nations reports have become a sort of I Ching. Maybe that's a reference from the 60s you won't get. Sort of like picking up the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and saying, can you find justification in here for something you want to do? Well, of course you can, because there's everything in the Hebrew Bible. Being violent, being nonviolent, forgiving, not forgiving. The UN goes through a process of exaggeration from the actual body of their report, where actual real scientists write down what they know based on statistical analysis, which is very cautious and careful, as statistics has to be. By the time the head of the UN is reading the press release, they're telling the world something completely different and totally exaggerated. What Roy Spencer described as his point of view that you just said, that we're not sure whether the 1 degree warming since 1900 is a half from carbon dioxide or a quarter from carbon dioxide, that actually is the position of the United Nations body, the alarmist body that's always misquoted, in the body of their report. They say one thing. They believe that 50% of the half-degree rise since 1950, which occurred mostly between 1980 and 2000, comes from carbon dioxide. They can't really tell you why, but that's sort of their expert judgment. They all agree that the warming of exactly the same size from 1920 to 1950 in the world, again, we're taking at face value some, back then, very difficult things to measure. We didn't have Roy Spencer's satellite records for the United Nations that only started in 1980. But everybody assumes there seems to be about a half-degree warming in the world from 1920 to 1950. The UN says that is completely natural. It has to do with reductions in volcano activity, which tend to cool things, and an increase in sunspot activity, which seem to increase things. This is the UN's explanation. So, of the 1 degree we've seen, roughly, in the last 120 years, between a quarter of a degree and a half a degree, the UN says, came from carbon dioxide. You can barely register that. It makes absolutely no impact on a local climate, which is why the UN also says, you never know this from their 12 years to live press releases, the UN body also says, hey, there's no higher rate per decade of hurricanes, rate of sea level rise, droughts, floods, etc., now from the period from 1920 to 1930. So since there's no statistically significant increase in the rates, you cannot say that today's hurricane or yesterday's wildfire or drought or something is in any way related to carbon dioxide. It's a minor warming gas. It is a warming gas, as you know, because its molecules vibrate at the same number of times per second as infrared leaving the Earth in a certain heating band. But it's a minor warming gas compared to water and the other major natural warmings. And it's a wonderful plant food. It's a powerful plant food. It's a little experiment here of increasing carbon dioxide levels from 3% of 1% of the atmosphere to 4% of 1% of the atmosphere has brought about a 15 to 30% increase in plant productivity all around the world in grasslands and in crops. So, just be careful when you listen to the UN. If you're listening to the UN explaining what they think the report has found at the sort of executive summary or press release, you'll be terrified and believe, like this poor young lady in the Scandinavian countries that we have 12 years to live, or the poor young lady in New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. But when you read the body of the report, like statisticians like me and climate scientists physicists at our organization do, you can see they're quite unalarmed. We should all take a deep breath, be thankful for the 85% of the world's energy that comes from cheap, reliable fossil fuels, and expand those in Africa, where only a quarter of people have electricity in their home. You know how they heat and light and cook in 75% of the homes in Africa? Does this person who says that we're killing people with air travel know that 3 million people die a year in Africa because of lung disease and heart disease that comes from having wood burned and dung burned and charcoal burned in your house as you're trying to live? That's indoor air pollution, is because they don't have electricity.
Yep. I mean, all of this is certainly true with regard to bettering the lives of folks. When you mention, we're talking to Dr. Caleb Rossiter, climate statistician, executive director of the CO2 Coalition. When you mention the half-degree Celsius increase since 1980 and the UN saying that that is maybe half or more created by human
Yes.
activity. They do say, at least many of the scientists with whom I've spoken, suggest that the climate is warming faster, that there's an acceleration effect. Do you believe that the climate is warming faster now than it was from the 1900 to 1950 period, or from the 1950 to 2000 period? Is there, in essence, some sort of exponential effect to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? You hear folks saying all the time, in the last 5 years were the 5 hottest years on record, and it's starting to increase every year on year. What do you make of that claim?
Ben, I'm so glad that you bring up these are 2 or 3 points, and I'll try to pick them up, because this is what I hear when I talk to members of Congress. Republican members of Congress. I can't talk to my Democratic friends anymore because they're just completely 100% on the team, and they can't barely be seen with me. But when I talk to Republican members of Congress and staff, they always bring up the hottest year. Is it accelerating? Is it unprecedented? Let's start with, is it getting hotter now at a rate faster than back in the natural period, 1920s, 1950s? The reason I'm proud to be a statistician is that you and I, Ben, and everybody else is alive because statistics work. We wouldn't have been given the antibiotics and vaccines when we were kids that make sure we could live to a ripe old age if the Food and Drug Administration hadn't run tests on a control group and a treatment group and seen that it actually works. The way they say it works, they have a statistical test to say that one group couldn't have been stronger than the other, even if the drug didn't work, more than 5% of the time. But you have to be 95% sure that it can't just be bigger. Two groups are always different by a little bit. We don't say if Hillary Clinton polls at 42.5% and Mitt Romney polls at 42.4%, you don't have a headline that says Hillary Clinton ahead, because it's a sample. They're sort of tied. It's within, the phrase margin of error?
Right.
That's a statistics phrase. It means you're 95% sure one is bigger than the other. So if you look at the warming rate, the so-called slope, how much is it going up per year or per decade from 1920 to 50, and the warming rate, which is the slope from 1980 to today, they are precisely the same, about a tenth of a degree per decade, meaning that's why we raise about 1 degree per century, because there's 10 decades times a tenth, right? They're exactly the same. They are statistically, mathematically too, identical. So, no, we're not warming faster than we did, and this comes from the UN's own surface thermometer temperature data, the one they're always trying to mess around with and make look a little bit better. If only Roy Spencer and his satellites and weather balloons had been operating from 1900 to 1980, I'd feel more confident, Ben, telling you I know exactly what was going on back then, because the satellite record is really the only one you can't corrupt, and it's very accurate, covers the whole world, whereas the thermometer record, you don't have many thermometers in many places for all those years, so there's a lot of error. Now, the funniest one for me as a statistician is that someone says, well, 4 of the last 5 years or something have been hotter than this, or it's the warmest June or something. If you look at the picture of the graph of temperature, which goes up from about the year 1700, naturally, there's no CO2 effect until about 1950, you see it's going up, and once in a while it'll plateau and stay sort of flat, and then it goes up again, and then it stays flat and goes up again. If you look at any chart like that, the most recent 3 or 4 years are, of course, the highest. You could have said this about 4 of the 5 hottest years since about the year 1700, and you'd be accurate, because we're in a general warming phase that clearly started very naturally. So anyone who says to you, I'm a scientist, and 4 out of the last 5 years, they're not a scientist, because that's just a mathematical joke. Of course we're at a high point. Recently, there's a good chance it's the highest month or the highest year, because we're at the top of the curve.
Well, Dr. Caleb Rossiter,
it's just an artifact.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and explaining some of these issues to the audience. Obviously, there are a lot more questions to be asked and a lot more open questions to be asked in an area that has been shut off to a lot of folks who are interested in science. Really appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you so much for your time.
I know, it's a Friday. Some stories. I